In this exercise, you're going to learn how to do bound seams. That's to put bias binding on both sides of the seam allowance. So we're going to need our basic seams and finishes pattern, and we're going to need to cut one of these out, and then of course on the notches, we'll separate it by cutting it down the line of the notches. So let's go ahead and get this cut out. Here's my fabric, and again, I don't have a selvage, so pull it. I've got some give. No give, so this is my straight grain. Line my pattern up with my straight grain. We're going to trace this pattern. Mark the notches. And then I'll go ahead and cut this out. And if you want to use your ruler and go ahead and draw your slash line to separate. Okay, so now we have either side of our seams, and I'm very quickly going to use my marking pen, and I'm going to mark my face side. And I'm going to put face sides together along that cut line, and pin if you would like. And you are going to sew this seam is going to be a 3/4 inch plain seam busted open. So you'll sew 3/4 inch seam all the way down, and you'll bust that open, press it open. And then you will need 2 strips of bias. This is 7.5 inches long, so I always cut mine a little bit longer. So the width on this is 1 3/8. And refer back to your cutting and joining exercise to remind yourself how to get your bias strips. Two strips, at least 7.5 inch by 1 3/8 inch wide. Alright, so we're ready to get to work on the bound seam. And to get started with that, we basically just need to sew the seam that we're going to put them on. So they're going to go on the seam allowances to clean finish those. So what we need to do, we need to sew a regular seam, and I've got my 2 pieces of fabric here, face sides together. Match up your edges really close, and to make it a little bit easier to grab onto those seams, we're going to sew a 3/4 inch seam allowance. So start your seam as usual, and just sew the seam. Alright, so here's your seam. We need to go to the press mat to press the seam open, and we'll get started with that bias that's going to be put on the bound seam. Alright, so we've got our seam, and I'm just going to press this real quick. Is that nice and flat? And then I'm just actually going to bust this open, the seam, like we've done before. Press this open, make sure everything is nice and flat. That looks good. So now we are actually looking at the inside of the garment. These seam allowances, now we kind of can see that the seam allowance is actually the face side of the fabric. That's what happens when we sew. And the underside of this is the continuation of the wrong side of the fabric. Now we've cut 2 pieces of bias that we're going to use to actually bind the edge of the seams. So there's a face side, as we drew our lines to signify the face side. I'm going to do one side at a time. I'm not going to do them both at the same time. So what I'll do is I'll go ahead and apply the binding to one seam allowance, and I'll talk you through the process. And then for the other side, I will just speed up the video so you can watch that process. So what we're going to do, we're going to choose one of these seam allowances to put the binding on. And what we're going to do is I'm going to fold it so we can see just that one seam allowance on the wrong side. And this is the seam allowance, this is the wrong side of the fabric. I'm going to take my binding piece and I'm going to actually sew it to the end of that seam allowance. Alright, so I'm going to actually pin this on so it's face side of the binding, the bias binding, to the wrong side of the seam allowance. And I'll just pin it here in place just so you can see that what is going on here. And we're going to sew this onto that seam allowance using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Alright, so now this is what I've got if I turn it this way, and it's just to that one seam allowance. Alright, so let's go sew this on. Alright, so we're ready to sew the bias binding to the seam allowance. That's what we're doing. And we've got everything lined up at the top. And so I'm going to actually just slide this under the presser foot, just past the needle. I'll put the needle down, and I'm actually going to remove this pin before I put the presser foot down. Again, just one more time, face side of the binding to the wrong side of the seam allowance. And I'm going to backstitch to start. This is a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and I'm going to sew all the way down, removing pins as I go. Remove this pin. Now, I cut my bias binding strip a little longer, and that's fine, but I'm going to stop my sewing right when I get to the edge. I'm going to get ready to backstitch. And that looks good. All right. So there is my bias binding sewn to my seam allowance. And now we need to do some pressing. So we'll go back over to the pressing mat. All right, so we've got our bias binding sewn to our seam allowance here, and I think the first thing I want to do is I want to cut this excess off. So line it up with that seam. There we go. All right, so what I want to do is I just got that one seam allowance, and I'm going to go ahead and press this and just kind of set those stitches in there. Okay, so now what I like to do is what we're going to do is we're actually going to be folding this over and then top stitching it right on top of there. But to do this in a couple of steps, what I like to do is I like to fold this over like this so that the bias binding is actually covering the seam allowance of the bias binding. So I'm just going to press that in place. This keeps everything nice and flat. Then I'm going to turn it over so I see my seam allowance and I see the bias binding, and what I'm going to do, this cut edge of the bias binding, I'm going to fold that to meet the edge of the seam allowance of the bias binding, and I'm going to go ahead and press that. Just press that down in place. Alright, so then once you've got that pressed, then have some pins nearby. I want you to fold that over, and you're just going to cover your stitch line. And I like to pin that in place. Okay, so now that I've got this pinned, let's talk about where to stitch. This is not pinning very well. There we go. Okay, so with those stitch lines now covered, it's all hidden. Where we want to stitch is normally about 1/16 away from that folded edge that we just folded over. The idea of that stitch line is that when we stitch on the face side here, on the underside of the seam allowance, our stitch line would still be on the binding. And if you look here, I'm kind of not far enough, so I'm going to actually look at this again, refold that over close to that stitch line, and then I will pin it. So think of the pins as when you're putting them in as on where your stitch line will be. And when you turn it over, you should see that pin on the other side, and that's where your stitch line will be. We want to keep the stitch lines on the binding, not on the seam allowance part. So I have one here that's a little bit over, so I'm going to repin. I'm going to re-push this back a little bit so that I can pin. And of course, we want our stitching to be consistent. And all of my pins are now on the binding. So let's go over and stitch this down. Alright, so we're ready to stitch our binding down to our seam allowance. So I'm going to actually get this under here, the presser foot, and stick the needle down real quick before I remove that pin, because I want the needle to hold that binding down. And again, remember, about where we have our pins is where we want to stitch. And just, you can come under here and just double check as well. I'm going to start off with the back stitch. And again, remember, find a point on your presser foot for where it's going in so your stitching remains even from the edge that you want your stitching to be from. And then remove your pins as you go. And just keep checking where your binding is landing in terms of the stitch line underneath. And I'm going to get ready to back stitch right here. So how does that stitching look? On this side, this was the side we were stitching on, it looks pretty even. So the moment of truth is turning it over. So I do have my stitching going on just the binding up here. We got a little bit off track up here at the top. That was right at the beginning. It's not that big of a deal. We could rip that out and correct it, but if this part were going into a seam, you probably wouldn't even notice it. So this is how we do our binding, our bound seam. And just remember that you're first sewing the bias binding onto the wrong side of the seam allowance. So on the inside of your clothes, when you bust your seams open, you're going to see the face side of your seam allowances. It's actually underneath that is where the wrong side of your seam allowance is. So now that we walked you all the way through that, I'm actually going to do the next one without any narration. so here is the final completed bound seams. I'm just going to open this up now and give it one final press with it flat. Alright, that looks pretty good. So we'll talk about this a little bit more in assessment.